The last thing the Hollow forgot was her name. Not lost, forgotten. There is a difference. Lost things leave gaps. Forgotten things leave silence, and silence in the Nullen Hollow had weight, had texture, had the specific density of 100 years of something held back from its conclusion. The elder who buried the records did it on a Tuesday, an ordinary day. Cold, as most days in the Hollow were cold, the black salt ridge breathing its mineral chill down through the iron root canopy and into the bones of anyone standing still long enough. She was not standing still. She moved through the compound library with the efficiency of someone who had made a decision and did not intend to spend time regretting it. Pulling texts, pulling testimonies, pulling the 3 handwritten accounts that described in careful clinical language what had happened the last time a Karen Omega walked into the territory of an Alpha who had no preparation for what she carried. She locked them in the glass cabinet. She hung the key 2 feet from the lock, because she was a pragmatist and understood that hiding a key entirely was its own kind of announcement. Then she sat down and wrote 7 lines in the margin of the public record. 7 lines that reduced a century of documented history to a footnote, that translated 3 lives and 1 catastrophe into administrative language, so dry it would never invite a second reading. She thought she was protecting the pack. She thought, as people who bury things always think, that buried meant gone. 101 years before Zyla, Moore ran through the iron root forest on split-soled boots with 43 coins and a name she had given herself. There was another woman. Her name is not in the records because the records were reduced to 7 lines, but the Hollow remembered it. The Hollow remembered everything spoken inside its boundaries. The black salt stone held sound the way water holds cold, long after the source was gone. Her name was Vale. She was 22 years old and she did not know what she was. She had spent her life being told she was the cause of everything that went wrong around her. Every pack that sheltered her became volatile within months. Every Alpha within range began to lose the precise boundaries between instinct and decision. She was blamed each time. She internalized it each time. By the time she reached the outer territories, she had made herself so small she barely registered her own existence. She had no idea her blood was speaking a language older than pack law. She had no idea that the Alpha of the Drevak pack, a wolf 2 generations before Draven Kale, a man named Soren who had ruled for 20 years with the kind of absolute control that becomes its own mythology, had felt her frequency from 3 miles outside his territory and had shifted before he understood he was moving. Soren found her in the borderlands. What happened after is the part, the 7 lines reduced to administrative language. He was not a bad man. That was what the elder's private notes said, the notes she did not lock in the cabinet because she burned those. He was not a bad man. He was an unprepared one. The Karen call did not manufacture feeling. It found what was already there and brought it to the surface without permission. And what was in Soren had been buried for 40 years under the weight of a title he had never asked for, and a loneliness so structural he had stopped experiencing it as pain and started experiencing it as architecture. Vale could not give him uninfluenced consent. He could not give her uncompromised protection. The bond between them was real, and it was impossible, and it did not care about either of those things. He claimed her. She let him because she had spent her entire life being told her presence was a weapon, and he was the first Alpha who had ever looked at her like. She was something worth standing in front of. The pack fractured within a year. Not because of cruelty. Not because of violence, because an Alpha consumed by an incomplete, unresolvable bond cannot lead, and a pack without a steady Alpha does not hold, and the Karen call kept amplifying what was between them until the signal drowned out everything else. Other Alphas from neighboring territories began to respond to her frequency. Border conflicts escalated. 3 wolves died in disputes that had no origin except the resonance of one woman's blood in the air. Soren sent her away to protect her. The separation killed him, not the physical death that came later. From a border conflict he led without the judgment the bond had consumed. The real death was earlier, the slow one, the one that anyone who had watched Draven Kale's father would have recognized. Vale lived, alone, in the outer territories. For 31 years, she lived with the knowledge of what she was and no language to name it, and no law to protect her and no record, because the elder had reduced her to 7 lines and hung the key 2 feet from the lock. She died on a Tuesday. The Hollow noted it the way the Hollow noted everything, without judgment, without ceremony, in the silver sap that ran down the ironroot trees and caught whatever light existed and held it until it was ready to be released. 101 years later, Draven Kale signed a new law into the Drevak record in his own blood. He did not know about Vale. He did not know her name. He did not know she had stood in the same compound library, that she had pulled the same historical texts before they were locked away, that she had sat in the cold mineral silence of the same stone room and learned the shape of what she carried too late to do anything but survive it. He did not know. But the Hollow knew. The black salt stone held the frequency of every name spoken inside its boundaries. Vale's frequency had been running for 101 years without resolution, a thread of the Karen call absorbed into the territory itself, patient in the way that only things with no alternative to patience can be patient. When Xylamore crossed the border 11 days into her escape, the Hollow recognized her blood. When Draven Kale inhaled in the ironroot dark, and went still and said nothing, and held her arm, and felt 14 years of architecture come loose in his chest. The Hollow had been waiting for exactly that moment. For exactly 101 years. The silver sap ran down the trees, and the black salt ridge breathed its mineral cold into the dark, and somewhere in the oldest part of the Nullen Hollow, a name that had been reduced to 7 lines in a margin pressed itself quietly against the present, and waited to see if this time the ending would hold. Chapter 1. The wolves had stopped howling 3 minutes ago. That was the wrong thing. Xylamore knew wolf patrol patterns the way she knew the sound of a door being locked from the outside, by repetition, by consequence, by the particular quality of dread that settled in the chest when something changed without warning. Howls meant position checks. Howls meant sentinels reporting. Silence meant they had found something worth stopping for. She pressed her back against the black salt ridge and did not breathe. The forest here was wrong in a way she had no language for. The trees grew in ironroot tangles, bark the color of old bruises, and the sap that ran down their trunks caught the moonlight and held it, silver and viscous and still. She had crossed into this territory 2 hours ago without knowing it. No markers, no scent posts, no boundary stones. Either this pack was arrogant enough not to mark their borders, or they marked them in ways she could not read. Both possibilities were bad. 11 days of running had stripped her to the essentials. Her coat was stolen. Her documents were forged. Her boots had split along the left sole and the cold came through in pulses, one with every step. She had 43 coins and half a strip of dried meat and a name that was not the one she had been born with. She had learned in 4 years of surviving people who owned her on paper that the body could endure more than the mind believed. The mind was the problem. The mind told stories. Don't tell a story right now. She found the shelter by accident, a half-collapsed structure built against the ridge face, 3 walls and a partial roof, old enough that the pack who built it had probably forgotten it existed. She told herself she would sleep 1 hour. No more. 1 hour and she would move again, push further from the border of the territory she had escaped, push toward the transit town 3 days east where forged papers would hold long enough to get her on a freight route. She was asleep in 4 minutes. She woke to silence that had weight. Not the silence of an empty forest, the silence of a forest holding its breath. Xyla opened her eyes and did not move. This was trained into her. The first second of waking was information only. She catalogued cold air, black salt smell, the distant sound of water over stone. And underneath all of it, a warmth that should not have been there. A ring of body heat. Close, multiple sources. She turned her head by degrees. They stood in a circle around the shelter. 8 of them. Large, dark-coated, still as carved stone in the ironroot shadows. Wolves shifted, massive, their breath making small clouds in the frozen air. Not one of them moved, not one of them growled. They watched her with amber eyes, and they were completely, utterly silent. She had been surrounded by pack wolves before. She knew what it looked like when they were about to close in. This was not that. They looked, and she had no word for it, arrested. Like something had reached into their instincts and pressed a hand flat against the door. She ran. 40 feet. She counted them without meaning to. It was another trained thing, measuring distance, measuring gap, measuring what she had to work with. 40 feet through frozen undergrowth, and then something stepped out of the tree line directly in front of her, and she hit him at speed, and they both stopped. His hand closed around her arm. He did not grip hard. He did not throw her back. He held. One hand, her forearm, and the contact landed in her body like a key turning in a lock she had not known was there. A strange, unwinding sensation in her sternum, a warmth that had no source, a stillness in her blood that she had never felt before and could not name and did not trust. She looked up. He was taller than anyone she had encountered in 4 years of navigating other people's territories. Dark clothing, no pack insignia visible, and a face that gave nothing. No anger, no threat display, no performance of authority. He looked at her the way a man looks at something that has disrupted every calculation he has made in the last 10 years, and he has not yet decided what to do about it. His sentinels had stopped reporting mid-patrol. He had come personally. That was the kind of alpha who came personally, one who trusted no account but his own, one for whom control was not a preference but a structural necessity. She knew the type. She had survived the type. Her arm tensed under his hand. His grip did not tighten. "Let go," she said. He did not let go, but something crossed his face, so fast she almost missed it. A fracture. A single moment where the absolute stillness of his expression broke open, and something raw moved underneath and then was gone. He inhaled. She watched it happen, watched his chest expand, watched his eyes change, watched the hand on her arm go motionless in a way that was different from before. Not restraint, not control. Something had stopped him from the inside. His sentinels were still frozen in the clearing behind her. The forest was still holding its breath. And Draven Kale, Alpha Prime of the Drevak pack, the wolf who had written the law and enforced it twice with his own hands, stood in the iron-root dark with his fingers around the arm of a woman who smelled like something that should not exist. And every certainty he had built across 14 years of absolute rule went quiet. Not gone, quiet. What is she? His hand did not move. His eyes did not move. The cold pressed down on both of them, and the silver sap ran down the trees, and the sentinels stood frozen in their circle, and Zyla Moore looked up at the alpha of this territory and understood, with the specific clarity of someone who had survived by reading rooms, that this man was not going to hurt her. She did not know what that meant. She did not know it was more dangerous than if he had. Chapter 2. Nobody in the compound looked at her directly. That was the first thing Zyla cataloged walking through the gate, the way every wolf in the courtyard found somewhere else to be with their eyes. Not avoidance, not hostility, something closer to the behavior of people standing too near a fire they did not light and cannot explain. They felt her passing. She watched their shoulders shift, their chins lift, their hands go still mid-task. And then they looked away, carefully, like looking too long cost something they could not afford. She had spent 4 years being invisible. This was not invisibility. Draven Kale walked 3 feet ahead of her. No restraints. No hand on her arm now. He had released her in the forest and had not touched her since, and she was aware of that distance the way she was aware of a sound just below hearing. The compound was built from the same black salt stone as the ridge, low and sprawling, lit by iron torch brackets that threw amber light across the ground. It smelled of pine resin and cold metal, and something underneath both. Something older, mineral, like the earth here had its own frequency. 2 sentinels fell into step behind her. She noted the exits. The intake room held a long table, 2 chairs, and Thuron Vask. The Beta was built like a man who had absorbed a great deal of the world's difficulties and filed them away for later. He had a ledger open in front of him and a pen in his hand, and he looked at Zyla with the measured attention of someone whose job was to see clearly. "Name," he said. "Zyla Moore." He wrote it. His pen did not pause. His eyes moved once to Draven, standing at the far wall with his arms at his sides, and then back to the ledger. The intake process took 40 minutes. Status, origin territory, registration number, pack affiliation. Zyla answered with the careful precision of someone who had rehearsed these answers so many times they had calcified into something that felt like memory. Thuron wrote everything and asked nothing extra. This was a man who understood that the space between questions was where the truth lived. Halfway through, she noticed his hands. He was not watching her. He was watching Draven. Specifically, he was watching Draven's hands, tracking some micro-detail she could not identify from her angle. Whatever he saw, his expression did not change. But he turned a page in the ledger with a deliberateness that felt like punctuation. She had spent 4 years reading rooms. She had learned that the most dangerous information in any space was what the powerful people were carefully not saying to each other. When Thuron took her documents to verify, Draven crossed to the window. He stood with his back to her. The torchlight caught the line of his shoulders. Her sternum did the thing again, that strange unwinding, warmth without source, a loosening of something she had kept wound tight for so long she had forgotten it was tension. She pressed her back teeth together. The feeling did not stop. It had nothing to do with him and everything to do with proximity, and she did not trust it at all. This is not safety. This is a different kind of cage. They put her in a room on the compound's east wing. Clean, sparse. A lock on the door that worked from the inside, which was either a genuine courtesy or a sophisticated cruelty, she had not decided. Lyra Vask brought her a meal without being asked. Broth, bread, dried fruit. The Beta's mate had a quality of stillness that was different from her husband's. His was professional. Hers was chosen. "The lock is yours," Lyra said, setting the tray down, "in case that question was keeping you from eating." Zyla looked at her. "It was," she said. Lyra left without another word. The door did not click. At the far end of the compound, in a room that held nothing unnecessary, Draven Kale sat at his desk with Zyla's documents in front of him. He had known within 60 seconds. The registration number was 1 digit off the correct Omega registry format. A mistake that would pass a frontier checkpoint, would survive a standard patrol query, but would not survive the desk of an alpha who had processed 200 legitimate registration documents and had a memory that retained structure the way iron retains heat. The name was real. The number was fiction. He should flag it. Protocol was unambiguous. Forged documentation on a detainee required immediate escalation to counsel, cross-referencing with Interpac missing registers, notification to the origin territory on file. He set the documents face down on the desk. He told himself he needed more information before escalating. He told himself a premature flag created diplomatic complications. He told himself the 48-hour detainment window gave him time to verify independently. His wolf did not bother with any of it. His wolf knew what it knew from the moment in the forest, that this woman's scent had reached into the locked room at the center of him and turned the handle from the inside, and that nothing since had moved it back. Not reason, not procedure, not 14 years of discipline that had never once cracked under pressure until tonight. He pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose. Outside, the compound had gone quiet. The torch brackets guttered in a wind off the Nullen Ridge. Somewhere in the east wing, behind a door with a lock that worked from the inside, a woman who had been running for 11 days was either sleeping or lying awake cataloging her exits. He understood both impulses. The knock came at 11:30. One knock, Thuron's pattern since they were 17 years old, and sharing a training barracks and learning the specific weight of responsibility neither of them had asked for. The note slid under the door. Draven picked it up. Read it once. The Sentinels are calling her the Hollow Girl. You should know that before tomorrow. He set the note on top of the face-down documents. He did not sleep. Chapter 3. Corvha was already awake when he arrived. That was the wrong thing. It was 4 a.m. He had told no one he was coming. The old elder sat in the center of her room in a high-backed chair with her hands folded in her lap and her clouded eyes fixed on the door as though she had been watching it for hours, waiting for a specific knock she had not heard in a very long time. She said, "Sit down, Draven." He had not spoken yet. He had not said her name. He had opened the door and she had already known it was him and told him to sit, and something in that landing in his chest like a stone dropped into still water. He sat. The room smelled of dried root herb and black salt smoke, and something beneath both, a quality of age that had passed through patience and come out the other side into something harder. Corvha had been elder for longer than Draven had been alive. She remembered his grandfather. She had stood at his father's bonding ceremony. She had watched Draven become alpha at 17 with an expression he had never been able to read and had never asked about. He looked at her now. "I need to describe something," he said, "and I need you to tell me what it is." She said nothing. Her hands stayed folded. He described the forest, the sentinels going still, the moment of contact. He described what happened in his chest, the unwinding, the warmth without source, the way his wolf had torn loose from 14 years of discipline in the space of a single breath. He described the grief that had arrived first, before anything else. He chose his words with the precision of a man dismantling something dangerous in the dark. He did not say her name. He did not say where she was now. When he finished, the room held the silence for a long moment. Corvha's expression did something he had not expected. It opened with relief. Then the relief collapsed into something that pulled at every line of her face, and her folded hands tightened against each other, and she looked at him with her clouded eyes and said, "I was afraid it would be you." The air in the room changed. "Tell me," he said. She told him. The Karen call was not legend. It was documented in the sealed historical records of the Drevak Pack's founding generation, in 3 separate elder testimonies spanning 90 years, in a passage of Pack Law preamble that had been quietly removed from the public record 40 years ago, when the last elder who understood its implications decided that knowledge of it caused more damage than ignorance. A Karen-blooded Omega carried a scent frequency so old it predated the pack system entirely. Not a signal, not a lure, a resonance, something that spoke directly to the primal wolf in any alpha within range and bypassed every layer of civilized restraint built on top of it. It did not manufacture feeling. That distinction mattered. It amplified what was already present, latent, unacknowledged, buried under years of control, and brought it to the surface without permission. Every alpha who had encountered a Karen Omega in the documented record had responded the same way. Complete loss of rational override, protective obsession, bond recognition so immediate it functioned like a physical blow. Draven's hands were flat on his knees. "The consent decree," he said. Corvha's chin lowered. There is a secondary clause. He had written the consent decree himself. He had read it 100 times. He had enforced it with his own hands on 2 separate occasions and had not lost sleep over either. There is no secondary clause, he said. There is one you were never shown. Her voice did not waver. Your grandfather wrote it and your father removed it from the distributed copy. It classifies a Karen Omega as a pack threat if her scent influences an Alpha's behavior without his consent. A pause, the weight of it settling. The prescribed sentence is exile or death at council discretion. The law I built is the weapon pointed at her. The thought arrived without permission, and he pressed it flat. The fire in the grate had burned low. Neither of them moved to tend it. Outside, the Nullen hollow wind pressed against the shutters, and the black salt trees bled their silver sap into the dark, and somewhere in the east wing of this compound, a woman with forged papers and split boots slept, or did not sleep behind a door with a lock that worked from the inside. Does she know what she is? He said. Corvha said, no. He stood. He said nothing further. He crossed to the door and put his hand on the frame and stopped 1 beat, 2, and then he left without looking back. He did not go to his room. His feet made the decision before his mind caught up. East wing, stone corridor. The torch bracket at the far end had burned out and the dark here was complete, and he stood outside her door and listened to the silence on the other side of it. His wolf pressed against his ribs like a tide against a wall. He stood for a long time. Then he turned and walked away. Inside the room, Zyla sat with her back against the wall beneath the window, her knees drawn up, her eyes open in the dark. She had not been asleep. She had been lying on the narrow bed staring at the ceiling when something changed in the quality of the air, a pressure, a warmth. A frequency she had no name for that moved through the door like it was not there, and landed against her sternum and spread outward. She had pressed herself to the wall before she understood she was moving. She held still and listened. No sound, no footsteps, nothing. And yet every nerve in her body was pulled taut toward that door like a compass needle that had found north for the first time, and did not know whether to trust the direction or run from it. The warmth faded slowly, retreating. She pressed her palm flat against the cold stone wall and waited for her blood to quiet. It took a long time. Down the corridor, in a room Corvha had not yet left, the old elder sat alone and drew a sheet of paper from the locked drawer in her writing table. She wrote 6 lines. She folded the paper once and pressed a wax seal to it, dark red, a mark that no one in the Drevak pack would recognize. It was not a Kale seal. She set it aside for the morning courier and folded her hands again and sat in the dying firelight and looked at nothing. And the expression on her face was the specific expression of a woman who has just set something in motion that she cannot call back. Outside, the Nullen Hollow held its breath. Chapter 4. Lyra Vask arrived with a second chair, and no explanation. She carried it through the door of Zyla's room, the way a person carries something they have already decided to put down, set it across from the narrow bed, and sat in it with a cup of tea in each hand, and the particular quality of patience that belongs to people who have learned that silence is not the same as emptiness. She held out 1 cup. Zyla took it. The ceramic was warm against her palms. She had not realized her hands were cold. I'm not here for information, Lyra said, in case that was the question. It had been the question. Zyla said nothing. I'm here because you've been alone in this room for 16 hours, and that's a long time to be alone with whatever you're carrying. Zyla looked at the tea. The compound sounds filtered through the small window, boots on stone, the distant clang of a training yard, a wolf calling something across the courtyard in the Drevak pack dialect she did not fully know. Life continuing, the ordinary texture of a pack that belonged to itself. She had forgotten what that sounded like. "I'm not carrying anything," she said. Lyra's expression did not change, but her eyes did a small, specific shift, the look of a woman filing something away without comment. They sat in silence for a while. It was not uncomfortable. That was the wrong thing. It should have been uncomfortable. A stranger in her room with a patient expression and a second cup of tea. But the silence here had a different quality than the silences she had learned to survive. Those silences had been loaded, pressurized. They meant someone was deciding something about her. This one was just open. Her sternum did the unwinding thing. She pressed her thumbnail into her palm, and it stopped. Lyra asked how long she had been traveling. Zyla said 11 days. Lyra asked before that, and Zyla said nothing for long enough that Lyra simply waited, and something about the waiting cracked the architecture of the answer open before Zyla had decided to give it. She did not tell it in order. She told it the way things come out when they have been held too long, in fragments, in the wrong sequence, in the flat tone of someone describing events that happened to a person they have since decided not to be. She had been 19. Her father's pack had debts. The bond-servant arrangement was legal in 3 outer territories, a loophole her father had found and walked through without looking back. The first pack she was sent to was the Voran. Within 8 months, the Voran's alpha had become erratic, territorial disputes with neighboring packs, internal rank challenges, a violence in the compound that had not been there before. She was blamed. She had provoked it, they said. She had unsettled something. The second pack was the Dresh. Same pattern, 6 months, chaos building like weather. The third, the fourth. Each time the blame arrived before the explanation. Each time she believed it a little more. By the time she reached the Halving pack, the one she had escaped 11 days ago, she had built her entire existence around the principle of invisibility. Make no eye contact. Take no space. Disappear into the routine of a place and hope that this time, this pack, she would not break something simply by existing inside it. The Halving had lasted 4 years. She had held herself so small, so still, so relentlessly invisible. It had not mattered. Lyra listened to all of it without moving. When Zyla stopped talking, the room held the words for a moment, the way a room holds smoke after a fire has gone out. Then Lyra said, "Whatever you were told you caused, that was never yours to carry." Zyla went still. Not the trained stillness, not the survival stillness. Something deeper, a stillness that reached all the way down into the place where she had buried the version of herself that used to ask why, the version that had stopped asking because the answer was always the same and always her name. She did not cry. She had not cried in 3 years. The mechanism for it had simply stopped working, like a door so long unused the hinges had fused. But her hands tightened around the cup, and the ceramic pressed warm against her palms, and her throat closed around something that had no name, and she sat with it, and did not look away, and did not look at Lyra, and did not speak. She doesn't know what I am. She just decided that anyway. The knock came at Thuron, Vask's door at 10:20. A sentinel, border breach, outer ridge, eastern approach. One tracker, now in custody, non-Drevak markings. A message had been transmitted before containment, content intercepted but not before the signal cleared the border. Thuron read the report twice. He identified the pack markings on the tracker's registration in 4 seconds. Halving. He went to Draven. The Alpha stood at the wide window of his study with his back to the room, hands at his sides. Thuron laid the report on the desk and said nothing. This was a skill he had refined over 20 years, the delivery of information without the inflation of it, the trust that Draven would take what he needed and leave the rest. Draven read it. His shoulders did not move. His hands did not move. His breathing did not change. The silence stretched to 10 seconds. 15. "Burn the message," Draven said. "The tracker never made it past the outer ridge." Thuron picked up the report. "And the tracker. He is a guest of the Drevak pack until I decide otherwise." A pause, one beat. "Nobody is taking her back." Thuron walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. In 20 years, he had watched this man make 200 decisions with the clean efficiency of someone for whom authority was a tool and never a pleasure. He had never once heard Draven use the word nobody with that particular weight, like it was not a policy, like it was a line drawn in something that would not wash out. He left without speaking. Down the corridor, in the east wing, Zyla sat alone in the dark with her cold hands and her silent throat, and a sentence she had not asked for that had reached into the architecture of everything she believed about herself and pulled one load-bearing stone free. The structure had not fallen yet, but it shifted. Chapter 5. The council chamber smelled of old authority and fresh hostility. Zyla knew the combination. She had stood in rooms like this before, not this room, not these wolves, but this specific arrangement of power where the table was long and the chairs were full, and every face wore the expression of people who had already decided and were performing the process of deciding as a courtesy to the outcome. 12 wolves, all seated, all watching her stand in the center of the room with no chair offered and no invitation to speak. She had been given 30 seconds of warning. Lyra had appeared at her door with a pressed gray tunic and an expression that carried an apology it could not deliver aloud. She had dressed and followed the sentinel and walked into this room and taken her position in the center and counted the exits by reflex. One door, behind the council, unreachable. She was already calculating something else. Solving Dret sat third from the left. She identified him in the first 10 seconds, not by rank insignia, but by posture. He held his chair like a man who had spent years deciding it belonged to someone else and had recently revised that opinion. Mid-60s, iron gray, with the particular watchfulness of someone who had learned that patience was a sharper instrument than aggression. He opened the hearing. Her documents were placed on the table. The forgery was named plainly: registration number invalid, origin territory unverifiable, status classification unconfirmed. Each point landed in the room with the flat weight of procedure. This was not cruelty dressed as process. This was process, which was worse. Then the halving claim was read into the record. The legal language was clean and cold and absolute. Bondservant arrangement, registered under Outer Territory Provision 12. Duration of service, 4 years, 11 months. Escaped without release. Property of the halving pack, Alpha Rock Ven, pending retrieval. Property. The word sat in the room. Zyla kept her eyes forward. Her hands were at her sides. The stone floor was cold through the thin soles of her repaired boots, and she focused on that, the specific cold of it, the unevenness of the old flagstones, the way her left foot carried slightly more weight than her right. Her sternum pulled toward the far end of the table. She did not look. She knew where he was sitting. She had known from the moment she walked in, not by sight, but by the warmth that gathered in her chest whenever he was within 30 feet of her, that sourceless, structural pull that she had spent 3 days trying to rationalize into something that did not mean what it felt like it meant. She kept her eyes on Solving Dret and did not look. At the far end of the table, Draven sat with his hands flat on the surface, and his face arranged into the expression she had learned was his working face. Still precise, the face of a man processing everything and revealing nothing. His left thumb moved, one small press against the table. Once. Solving Dret moved to return her to the halving pack under Interpack property law. He cited 3 precedents. His voice was measured, reasonable. The voice of a man who understood that the most effective blade was one that looked like a formality. Every eye in the room moved to the end of the table. To Draven. He was the law. He would rule. The silence lasted 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, Zyla felt the pull in her chest reach a pitch that pressed against the inside of her ribs, and she understood with absolute clarity that every person in this room was waiting for him to either save her or abandon her, and that her entire existence in this moment had been collapsed into a procedural question at the end of a long table. She looked at Solving Dret. "I have been property before," she said. Her voice did not shake. "I know what it looks like from the inside." A breath. "Do what you're going to do." The room went very still. Not the held breath stillness of the forest. Something different, the stillness of 12 wolves recalibrating, of a room that had expected one thing and received another. She had not begged. She had not looked to the end of the table for rescue. She had looked at the man with the blade and named what he was holding. Solving Dret's expression did not change, but something moved behind his eyes. Draven's voice came from the end of the table, measured, procedural, carrying the specific weight of a man who knew exactly which legal instrument he was reaching for. The detainee remains in Drevak custody pending independent verification of the halving claim's validity under current Interpac statutes. A pause. The motion to transfer is deferred. This hearing is adjourned. It was not a rescue. It was a procedural delay. Technically, legally, precisely correct. It bought time and nothing else and made no promises and broke no rules and gave Solving Dret nothing he could use. Solving Dret smiled. It was a small smile, contained, the smile of a man who has just found a thread worth pulling. She was 3 steps into the corridor when he appeared beside her. Solving Dret. No sentinel with him, no witnesses she could identify. He moved with the unhurried ease of a man who understood that timing was everything and had chosen this particular moment with care. He did not touch her. "He is going to destroy you trying to keep you," he said. She stopped walking. "Ask Corvo what a Karen Omega's sentence is." His voice was almost kind. That was the worst part of it, the almost kindness of it, the performance of concern from a man who had just tried to have her return to a pack that had treated her as inventory. Then decide if his protection is worth what it costs. He walked away. She stood in the corridor, and the cold stone pressed up through her boots, and the torch bracket above her head threw amber light across the wall, and the word Karen sat in her chest like something swallowed the wrong way. She had heard it before. She could not remember where. At the far end of the corridor, behind a closed door, she felt the pull in her chest shift, a tightening, a change in frequency, as though whatever thread connected her sternum to that room had just been wound 1 turn tighter. She pressed her back against the wall. She would find Corvo in the morning. The torch above her guttered once and held. Chapter 6. Thuron Vask used 7 words and then stopped talking. "You cannot be serious," he said. Then silence. The specific silence of a man who has spent 20 years trusting another man's judgment and has just encountered its outer limit. He stood in the center of Draven's study with the formal claim document from Rock Ven in one hand and the expression of someone recalculating everything he thought he understood about the morning. Draven did not look up from the desk. "It is the only move that holds," he said. "There are 3 other moves. 2 of them require council approval. Solving Dret will kill both before noon." Draven set down his pen. "The 3rd returns her to the halving pack. That is not a move." Thuron set the document on the desk with a precision that communicated everything he had decided not to say aloud. He looked at his alpha for a long moment. Then he picked up the document again and left to begin the paperwork, because 20 years had also taught him when a decision had already been made before the conversation started. The door closed. Draven looked at the wall. The formal Interpact claim had arrived at dawn, Rockven's seal, his beta's countersignature, the retrieval party notification attached as a rider. 7 wolves, arriving in 4 days. The claim was airtight under current Interpact statute. The Halving Pack had registration documentation. They had the outer territory provision. They had 4 years of paper that described a human being as a line item in a ledger. 4 days. He pulled the guardianship form toward him and signed his name. Lyra carried Xyla's things to the Alpha Wing in one trip. There was not much. A stolen coat, a change of clothes, a small knife she had not declared an intake that Lyra set on the table without comment. Xyla stood in the doorway of the new room and looked at the space. Larger than the East Wing room. A proper window. A writing table. A lock that worked from both sides, which was new information she held carefully. "Don't fight it," Lyra said. She set the coat across the chair back. "Let him keep you safe while you figure out your exit." Xyla looked at her. "You think I need an exit?" "I think everyone needs an exit." Lyra's voice was even. "Having one doesn't mean you use it." She left. The door stayed open. The Alpha Wing had a different texture than the rest of the compound. Quieter. The stone here was darker, the torch brackets further apart, the air carrying that mineral undertone she had come to associate specifically with proximity to Draven, black salt, and something older beneath it, something that her blood recognized before her mind caught up and pressed it back down. She had stopped fighting the recognition. She had started simply nodding it and moving past it, the way you note weather. She unpacked her coat. She set the knife under the mattress. She sat at the writing table and looked at the wall and thought about Kavha, and the name Solving Dret had placed in her chest like a splinter, and the fact that she had not yet found the courage to go find the old elder and ask the question she already suspected the answer to. The pull in her sternum shifted. He was close. The dining room off the Alpha Wing held one long table, and that evening, 2 place settings at opposite ends of it that Lyra had clearly positioned with diplomatic intent. They both moved to the middle without discussing it. Not close. Closer than the ends. 4 feet of table between them and 2 plates of food neither of them had ordered, and 40 minutes of silence that had more texture than most conversations Xyla had survived. She ate, he ate. The fire in the grate spoke more than either of them. She had planned to stay silent. Silence was the tool she knew best. But the 40 minutes built something, not comfort, not ease, but a specific pressure. The pressure of 2 people in a small space with a large thing neither of them is nomming. And at the 41st minute she put down her fork and said, "Why did you execute him?" Draven looked up. "The Alpha who broke the decree," she said. "Why did you do it yourself? You have enforcers." The fire shifted. A log settled. "Because I wrote the law," he said. "A man who writes a law and pays someone else to enforce it does not believe in it. He believes in the appearance of it." She had not expected that. She had expected procedure. Rank, the language of authority explaining itself. "What made you write it?" she said. The silence this time was different. Not empty, full of something being decided. "My father," he said. "His mate died before their bond sealed. The incomplete bond," he stopped, started again. "It does not release, it stays open, like a wound that cannot close because the other half of it no longer exists." His hands were flat on the table, still. "He lasted 3 years. I was the one who ended it." The room held that. Xyla looked at him across 4 feet of table. and the fire threw amber light across the space between them, and something in her chest unwound, so far it reached the edges of her, and she pressed her thumbnail into her palm, and it did not stop this time. He told me the truth. He did not have to tell me the truth. I wrote the law, Draven said, so that no wolf in this pack would ever treat want as justification. He looked at her directly. Want does not justify, ever. She understood he was also talking about himself. Neither of them spoke again. They finished eating in silence that now had an entirely different weight, not the absence of communication, but the presence of too much of it, compressed into the 6 inches of space between his hand and hers on the table that neither of them crossed, and both of them knew was there. He stood on the black salt ridge an hour later. The Nullen Hollow spread below him, iron root dark, silver bleeding, the compound lights amber against the cold. His wolf had been quiet all evening. The controlled, deliberate quiet of something waiting for the moment attention lapses. He felt it move. A reach not outward, but inward, toward the thread that had existed in his chest since the forest, the thread he had identified and named and refused to pull. His wolf found it in the dark and wrapped around it and pulled. He stopped it. The effort left a sound in his chest, like something tearing at the root. He stood on the ridge until his breathing steadied, until the pull receded, until he was certain he had control again. It had taken longer than it should have. Below him, in the Alpha Wing, a light burned in a window that had not held light in years. Chapter 7. Draven had not slept in 3 days, and his wolf was starting to show it. Not in his face, not in his voice. In the small things, the way he stopped mid-sentence in a briefing and looked at the wall for 2 seconds before continuing. The way his hand went to the window frame when he stood near glass, gripping the wood with a steadiness that meant the steadiness was no longer automatic. Thuron noticed. Thuron noticed everything and said nothing, which was worse than questions. The fragments had started on the 2nd night. Not dreams. He was not sleeping enough to dream. These arrived in the space between one thought and the next, sensory intrusions, sharp and sourceless. A cold room. Stone floor, no covering, the specific cold of a place that was never meant to be lived in. The sound of a door being locked from the outside. A quality of silence that had weight to it, the silence of someone making themselves as small as possible, compressing breath and heartbeat and presence down to nothing, because nothing was safer than something. He knew they were not his memories. He knew exactly whose they were. The bond was transmitting. Not images. The bond did not work in images. It worked in the body, in sensation, in the emotional residue of experience carried in the blood. And her blood was speaking to his with a clarity that stripped every managed distance he had constructed across the last 6 days down to nothing. He had felt her hunger as his own at 2 in the morning. He had felt the specific muscle ache of someone who had walked too far on a split-soled boot. He had woken from a half-sleep with his hands fisted at his sides, and a rage in his chest that did not belong to him, cold and old and patient, the rage of someone who has been wronged so many times they stopped expecting otherwise. He did not tell her. He pressed it all flat and went to his briefings and signed his documents and did not sleep. The compound library was 2 rooms deep and largely unused by anyone under 60. Zyla had found it on the 2nd day in the Alpha Wing, drawn by the specific smell of old binding glue and mineral dust, and she had understood immediately that it was the one place in the compound where her presence would register as ordinary. People used libraries for research. Research was not suspicious. She had a list of questions, and she was working through them in order. Drevak Pack Law filled 6 shelves on the north wall, current statutes, historical amendments, council records going back 4 generations. She read with the focused efficiency of someone for whom information had always been a survival tool. She found the consent decree on the third day. Read it twice. Noted the structure of it, the specific language, the way it was written by someone who understood that law without personal investment behind it was architecture without foundation. She noted the absence of a secondary clause. She pulled the historical archive index. The sealed texts were cataloged but not hidden. Sealed meant restricted access, which in a compound library with no librarian meant a locked glass cabinet with a key hanging on a hook 2 feet away. She looked at the key for a long time. Then she took it. The text was 80 years old. The language was formal, dense, and completely clear. She read the Karen call documentation in full. The history, the mechanism, the documented cases, 3 alphas across 2 centuries, all of them described with the clinical detachment of wolves trying to contain something they did not understand. She read the secondary clause in the original preamble, the one removed from distributed copies, the prescribed sentence. Exile or death at council discretion. She closed the book. Her hands were flat against the cover. The library was cold and quiet, and the mineral smell pressed around her, and she sat with what she had read and let it move through her without expression, the way she had learned to receive bad news, not resisting it, not collapsing under it, simply letting it find its level. So that is what I am. That is what this has always been. She put the book back exactly where she found it. She replaced the key on its hook. She walked to the door and stopped, one hand on the frame and breathed twice. Then she went to dinner. Lyra said something about the Sentinel's failed attempt to herd the compound's 3 territorial dogs away from the training yard, and the image she built with the telling was specific enough that Zyla smiled. A real one. Brief, involuntary, gone in a second. She did not look at Draven. She had not looked at him directly since the library. She kept her eyes on her plate, on Lyra, on the fire, on the middle distance. She spoke when spoken to. She answered questions. She performed the texture of an ordinary evening with a precision she had spent 4 years perfecting. He noticed. She felt the moment he noticed, not through sight but through the bond, through the shift in the frequency of the warmth in her chest, a change in quality from the steady background pulled to something sharper. Focused. He was looking at her the way a man looks at a pattern that has changed and is calculating what the change means. She reached for her cup. Her hand was steady. Do not look up. Do not give him the shape of it. Across the table, Draven's hands were still. She could see them in her peripheral vision, both flat on the table, controlled, precisely controlled, and she understood that the control had a cost tonight that it had not had yesterday, and that the cost was climbing. She did not look up. She said good night to Lyra. She said good night to Thuron. She carried her cup to the basin and set it down and walked to the door, and her spine held every inch of the walk with a deliberateness that took everything she had. Corvha came at midnight. One knock. Zyla opened the door. The old elder stood in the dark corridor with her clouded eyes and her folded hands and the expression of a woman arriving at a conversation she has been postponing. You found the text, Corvha said. Yes. Then you know you have to run. Zyla looked at her. The corridor was cold. The torch bracket down the hall threw a thin line of amber across the stone floor between them. I know, Zyla said. Neither of them spoke of the coat still hanging on the chair, the knife still under the mattress, the bag she had not packed, the exit she had not mapped. Corvha held her gaze for a long moment. Then she turned and walked back down the corridor, and the amber light swallowed her, and the dark closed behind her, and Zyla stood in her doorway alone with the full weight of what she knew pressing against her ribs. She did not pack. She closed the door and stood with her back against it, and her eyes on the ceiling. Outside, The Nullen Hollow pressed its cold against the window. She did not pack. Chapter 8. The alarm bell had been ringing for 40 seconds before Zyla understood it was real. Not a drill. The compound had run a perimeter drill on her third day. She had cataloged the sound then, filed it, assigned it to the category of things that did not require her to move. This was different. This had a quality the drill had not, a raggedness in the rhythm, the sound of a hand hitting metal with urgency rather than procedure. And underneath it, threading through the compound walls like something seeping through stone, the smell of blood that did not belong to anyone inside. She was already moving before the first howl broke. The corridor outside the Alpha wing filled fast, sentinels running, 2 pack members in half-shift pushing toward the outer gate, someone shouting a position count in the Drevak dialect. She caught one word clearly: Ven. She pressed against the wall and let them pass and thought. The children's shelter. Outer ridge, northeastern face, where the salt cave cut into the hillside 50 meters from the compound's weakest wall. Lyra had shown her on the third day, not as strategy, as orientation, the casual geography of someone explaining where things were. 3 young pack wolves slept there under rotating sentinel watch. The sentinel rotation changed at 3 in the morning. She ran toward the ridge. The compound behind her was chaos with structure. She could hear Draven's voice cutting through it. 3 words of command that reorganized the noise into something directed. And the pull in her chest went taut and bright, and she ran harder because the pull told her exactly where he was, and where he was not where the children were. The outer ridge path was 40 meters of frozen ground and ironroot obstacle. She covered it in the dark by feel, by the black salt smell of the cave face, by the thin line of amber from the shelter's single interior light visible under the door. She heard the wolves before she saw them. 2, large. The Ven pack ran darker coats than Drevak, almost black, built heavier through the chest. They had not reached the door yet. They were 15 meters out, moving with the specific patient deliberation of wolves who knew what was inside and were not rushing because they did not believe anything inside could stop them. She reached the door first. 3 seconds. She got it open, got through, pulled it behind her, dropped the iron bar into its bracket. The oldest child was already awake, a boy of maybe 9, sitting up with his eyes wide and his small hands flat on the blanket, holding himself still the way children hold still when they understand that stillness is the only tool they have. She put her finger to her lips. She sat down on the floor between the door and the children, and she breathed. Outside, the 2 wolves reached the door. She heard them stop. She did not know it was happening. That was the thing she would not understand until later. She had no awareness of it as action, no sense of reaching for something or deploying something or making a choice. She sat on the cold salt cave floor with 3 children pressed against the wall behind her and the iron door between her and 2 wolves built to kill. And her body did what her body had apparently always done without her knowledge or consent. Her scent shifted. The Karen call did not announce itself. It did not build like music or arrive like weather. It moved through the iron door like iron was nothing, like the door was not a barrier, but simply a medium, a surface it passed through on its way to the thing it was meant to reach. Outside, one wolf made a sound. Not a growl, not an attack vocalization. Something lower, confused, the sound an animal makes when its own instincts have turned against its instructions. Then silence. Then a soft thud, the sound of a large body sitting down in frozen dirt without understanding why. The second wolf made the same sound, sat down, then quietly began to whine. The oldest child looked at Zyla. She looked at the door. What is happening out there? The whining continued. Low, steady, directionless, not pain, not aggression, something that had no category she could name. She pressed her palm flat against the cave floor, and the cold salt stone pressed back, and she held still and breathed and did not move. The door tore open from the outside. Not gently. The iron bracket held for 1 second, and then Draven's hands found the frame, and the wood gave, and the cold night air hit her face, and he was standing in the door with blood on his jaw, and his left arm held at a specific angle that meant the shoulder had taken damage, and his eyes found her in the dark with an immediacy that stopped the breath in her throat. Behind him, 2 Ven wolves sat in the dirt, docile, whining softly, unharmed. Draven looked at them, looked at her, looked at the children behind her. His chest moved, one breath, deep, the breath of a man absorbing information that is reorganizing something fundamental. She stood up. "Are the others okay?" she said. He did not speak. She watched his face move through something she could not name, not the working face, not the controlled alpha face, something underneath both of those, something that had no professional category and was not trying to find one. His hand came up and gripped the door frame, and the knuckles went white, and he looked at her across the 3 feet of salt cave threshold, and the Nullen Hollow wind moved between them, and he still did not speak. "He knows what I did. He does not know that I don't." She did not say it. Solving Dret was found in the eastern storage corridor 40 minutes later with a sealed satchel and Ven pack markings on the inner lining. The correspondence inside required 4 minutes to read and contained everything: the back-channel communication, the description of what Xyla was, the agreed signal that had opened the compound's eastern gate at 3 in the morning. 2 sentinels brought him before Draven in the main hall. The hall had 40 wolves in it. The breach was contained. The Ven retrieval party, those still mobile, were in compound custody. The 3 children were with Lyra. The wounded were being tended. Draven stood in the center of the hall, and Solving Dret was placed in front of him, and every wolf in the room went still. Draven looked at him. He said nothing. 10 seconds. 20. The fire in the main grate threw amber across the stone, and Solving Dret's composure held for 15 seconds and then developed a crack along its left edge. A small movement in his jaw, a tightening around the eyes, the specific deterioration of a man who had prepared for anger and received something worse. 30 seconds. Draven's silence had weight. It had texture. It pressed against every surface of the room and found the weak points in everything it touched. 40 seconds. Solving Dret looked at the floor. Draven had not moved, had not spoken, had not touched him. In the doorway behind the hall, Xyla stood with dried salt cave dust on her hands and the children's warmth still on her skin, and watched the most controlled man she had ever encountered hold a silence so complete it functioned as verdict, as sentence, as everything the law would take days to say. The Nullen Hollow wind pressed against the compound walls. The silence held. Chapter 9. The council had been in session for 2 hours when Draven called the recess. No reason given. One word, recess, delivered in the flat tone that did not invite negotiation, and 11 wolves pushed back their chairs in silence because the 12th had already left the room. The door closed behind him. In the corridor outside the council chamber, the compound was running on no sleep and cold adrenaline, the specific texture of a pack that has survived a night attack and has not yet decided what it means. He found her in the library. Of course she was in the library. She had her back to the door and a closed book on the table in front of her and her hands flat on its cover, and she did not turn when he entered, which meant she had felt him coming and had decided to let him arrive rather than meet him halfway. He stood in the doorway. She said, "How bad is it?" Not a question. She already knew the shape of it. She had known since solving Dret's name, and the word Karen in the same sealed document reached the council table. He could see it in the set of her shoulders, that specific stillness she carried when she had already absorbed the blow and was deciding what to do with the aftermath. They invoked the secondary clause, he said. 2 members, formal motion, 24 hours to rule. She turned then. Her face gave him nothing. That was the wrong thing, not the absence of expression he had learned to read as composure, but a different kind of nothing, the nothing of someone who has already run every calculation and arrived at the same answer from every direction. "Sit down, Draven," she said. He sat. He told her everything. The Karen call, the mechanism, the documented history. The secondary clause in its original language. He told her what Corvha had said and what he had done with it, and what he had chosen not to do in the 48 hours between learning and now. He told her about the fragments, the cold room, the stone floor, the quality of silence he had felt in his chest at 2 in the morning that did not belong to him. Her breathing changed when he said that, a small hitch, contained. He told her it was not her fault. The pull in his chest was at full pitch now, proximity and bond recognition, and something older than both, the specific weight of sitting 3 feet from the person his wolf had identified as the other half of a frequency that had been broadcasting into empty air for 14 years. His shoulder still ached from the breach. He had not had it seen to. He was aware of the specific foolishness of that and did not move. She looked at her hands on the table. "You know, if you claim me," she said, "they will say the call manipulated you. They will never believe it was real." "I know. It ruins your law, everything you built." "I know." She looked up. Her eyes held the question she had not asked, the one underneath all the others, the one that had been there since the forest, since the first night, since the cold corridor outside her door that she had felt through the wall and pressed her back against the stone and waited for her blood to quiet. "Is any of this yours, or is it all just the call speaking?" He answered the question she had not asked. "I executed a man for touching an omega without her consent." His voice was even. "The decree was never about the law." A breath. "It was about my father. It was about making sure no wolf in this pack ever lost himself the way he did, over a bond that was real and still destroyed him. I spent 14 years building walls high enough that what happened to him could not happen to me." The library was cold. The mineral smell pressed around them. Somewhere in the compound, a door opened and closed, and the sound reached them and faded. "Zyla," he said her name the way a person sets something down that they have been carrying for a long time. "I became him the second I scented you. The only difference is you are still here, and I am asking." The room held that. She looked at him for a long time. The pull between them was so tight it had its own sound, not audible but present, a frequency in the air that pressed against every surface. Her throat moved. Her hands stayed flat on the table. Then she said, "Asking what?" The council chamber had not emptied during the recess. 11 wolves sat or stood in various configurations of exhaustion and tension when the door opened again. Draven entered first. Zyla walked 2 steps behind him. Every eye moved between them with the particular attention of wolves reading a dynamic that had shifted in a room they were not in. Draven stood at the head of the table. He did not sit. He said, "The motion under the secondary clause is withdrawn." A council member to the left, older, careful, said, "The motion was formally entered. Withdrawal requires. It requires the Alpha to dissolve the instrument the clause exists within." Draven reached into his coat. He placed a small knife on the table, plain, iron-handled, the kind of knife that had one specific ceremonial function in Drevak Pack law. An Alpha may rewrite standing law once in his reign. In his own blood, before witnesses. The room went absolutely still. This was the thing nobody had expected. Not a defense, not a procedural countermove, not the sharp legal instrument he had deployed in every council confrontation for 14 years. He was not working within the law. He was changing it. He drew the knife across his palm, set it down, pressed his bleeding hand flat against the blank page of the amendment record, and spoke the dissolution in full, the formal language, every clause of the consent decree named and released, and in its place, a single replacement statute, 7 sentences, that his beta had clearly helped him draft because the language was precise in the way that Thuron's thinking was precise, and it carried Draven's conviction the way iron carries heat. No Omega would be classified as a pack threat for the nature of what she carried. The call was not a weapon. It was a frequency, and no wolf could be sentenced for the involuntary language of their own blood. He let the page dry. Then he came around the table and stopped in front of Zyla, and the room held its breath, and he went to one knee, not submission, not performance, not the language of dominance offering itself downward as a gesture. The specific posture of a man making himself answerable, making himself small enough to be refused. "I am asking," he said, his voice was low, steady, "if you choose to stay." The council did not move. Zyla stood in front of the kneeling alpha of the Drevak pack with 11 witnesses, and the smell of iron and black salt and old authority pressing around her from every direction. And the pull in her chest had gone from a frequency to a presence, warm, steady, the warmth of something that had been waiting a very long time to be allowed. Her throat closed. She had not cried in 3 years. The mechanism had fused. She had tested it in dark rooms and found nothing, a dry hinge, a door that no longer opened. One tear ran down her face. She did not wipe it away. The council waited. Draven waited. The Nullen Hollow pressed its cold against the chamber windows, and the fire in the grate held its light, and Zyla Moore stood in the silence with one tear on her face, and the answer sitting in her chest like a stone that had finally found the ground. She had not spoken yet. Chapter 10. She said no. Not to him, not to the bond, not to the Nullen Hollow or the Black Salt Ridge or the 11 wolves holding their breath in a council chamber that smelled of iron and old authority. She said no to the shape of the thing being offered, the claim, the title, the lunahood that arrived preformed, pre-named, waiting for her to step into it the way a person steps into a role that was built around someone else's measurements. Draven was still on one knee. She looked at him and said, "I will not be claimed because the bond demands it. I will not be Luna because you need one." Her voice was even. It carried to every corner of the room without effort. "When I choose it, I will choose it, on my own terms, in my own time." The council did not move. She could feel the shock of it pressing against her from 11 directions. Not hostility, not anger. The specific stunned silence of wolves who had watched their alpha dissolve a centuries-old law and go to his knee, and had fully anticipated one kind of ending. Draven looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood. "Then I will wait," he said. 3 council members exchanged a look. Thuron Vask, standing at the chamber's edge, looked at the ceiling briefly with the expression of a man recalibrating his entire understanding of the next several years. Lyra, beside him, pressed her lips together around something that might have been a smile. Draven held Zyla's gaze. She held his. The fire in the grate burned on. The weeks that followed had a different texture than anything that had come before. Not easier, not lighter, but different in the specific way that honest ground feels different underfoot after years of walking on surfaces that shifted without warning. Zyla learned the difference between the two by feel, By the absence of the constant low-level calculation she had run for 4 years, the exhausting arithmetic of invisibility, the daily accounting of how much space she was taking and whether it was too much. She took space now, deliberately, as practice. She and Lyra built the framework in the compound library, the same room where she had found the sealed text, where the locked cabinet still held its history, where the key hung on its hook 2 feet from the lock. She pulled that key down on the first morning and set it on the table between them, and Lyra looked at it and said nothing, which was the correct response. The Omega Rights Framework took 11 days to draft. It was 7 pages long and addressed registration, bond servant provisions, territorial claim procedures, and the specific legal language that had allowed 4 years of her life to be described as property management. She wrote the section on bond servant arrangements herself. The language was plain and cold and precise and left no gaps. Draven signed it into Drevek Pack law on the 12th day, without amendment. She had not asked him to. He had read it, asked 2 clarifying questions about enforcement mechanisms, and signed it. That was all. She stood in the doorway of his study and watched him set down the pen and felt the bond thread in her chest shift, not tighten, not pull, but warm a degree, the way stone warms when the sun has been on it long enough. She noted it. She did not move toward it yet. The Karen call she approached the way she approached everything that had been used against her, slowly, from a direction of her own choosing, with no audience. She went to the Black Salt Ridge alone on the 4th morning before anyone else was moving, and she sat in the cold and she breathed, and she let the frequency find its level without directing it. It felt like learning a language she had been speaking wrong her whole life. The sounds were familiar. The grammar was new. The Interpack tribunal on the halving claim ran for 3 days. Draven's legal team presented the bond servant documentation alongside 4 years of compound records from 3 other packs that had held her, cross-referenced against the Outer Territory Provisions' own statute of limitations. The case dismantled the halving claim entirely and took 5 supporting provisions with it as it fell. Rock Venn was stripped of his alpha rank on the tribunal's final day. The case rippled outward. 6 territories, 4 other bond servant arrangements flagged for review, something that had existed in the law's margins for decades named plainly, informal record for what it was. Zyla heard the verdict read and felt nothing dramatic. No relief that announced itself. No collapse of something long held. A quieting, the specific quieting of a sound that has been present so long you stopped hearing it, gone now, and the silence where it was taking some adjustment to trust. Korvha found her on the ridge the evening after the verdict. The old elder moved slowly but arrived with intention, lowering herself onto the flat saltstone beside Zyla and looking out over the Nullen Hollow with the patience of someone who has been looking at the same view for 90 years and still finds it worth looking at. "You are the first," Korvha said. Zyla looked at her. Every Karen Omega in the recorded history of this pack. The elder's voice was even, factual. Every one of them was owned before she was named, claimed before she understood what she carried. The power was always there. No one ever gave it room to become hers first. She paused. The hollow wind moved through the ironroot trees below. "You are the first one who knew before." Zyla sat with that. The silver sap caught the last of the light and held it, bright lines running down dark bark, the hollow's specific language, a thing that happened here and nowhere else. She had stopped finding it strange. She had started finding it legible. She heard him before she saw him. The bond thread gave him away, that warmth, directional now, coming up the ridge path from the compound with the unhurried pace of someone who was not sure of his welcome and had decided to come anyway. Korvha stood. She looked at Zyla once. Then she walked back down the path and past Draven coming up and said nothing to either of them, which was its own kind of statement. He stopped 2 feet away, stood beside her, looked at the hollow. The silence between them was not empty. It had never been empty. It had always been full of everything neither of them had said, and lately it had started carrying something new, not tension, not the taut, unbearable pull of the previous weeks, but a warmth that sat between them like a third presence, patient, unhurried, willing to wait as long as it needed to. She reached out and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, once steady. "I'm not ready to be claimed," she said. "I know." The hollow spread below them, iron root and silver bleed and ancient cold. "But I'm ready to stay." His hand held hers, and the bond thread in her chest, taut and aching across 10 chapters of iron restraint and impossible distances, went warm. Not sealed, not complete. The warmth of something chosen rather than claimed, built rather than bound, arriving not with a crash but with the specific quiet of a door opening from the inside. Below them, the Nullen Hollow went still. In the oldest part of the Cairn forest, where the trees bled silver and the salt remembered every name ever spoken into it, the hollow finally had a Luna. She just hadn't told anyone yet.